achieved.
Welcome back to Kamikaze Overdrive MMA Predictions. As always, I am your host, Scott Johnson, and on this episode of the show, we're taking a look at not one, but two UFC events, as UFC Fight Nights 43 and 44 will take place in the same night, which is June 28th, with UFC Fight Night 43 coming to us live from Auckland, New Zealand, and 44 taking place in San Antonio, Texas. I'll be giving you my 4 main card predictions for the Auckland event and my 6 main card predictions for the UFC for the San Antonio event. All of my preliminary breakdowns will be available at kamikazeoverdrive.net, and I'm using air quotes when I say all my predictions because there are a ton of predictions that I'm putting together for this event. And preliminary predictions, there's a couple fights I'm going to exclude simply because I don't have the time. In addition to that, it's exam time and report card time for me, so I'm swamped, and I'm going to do my absolute best. On a similar wavelength, for these fights, this is the first time I've ever done this. I usually sit down and write out a series of point forms and bullets points that I want to hit on it with each fight. I'm not doing that for this fight. I'm flying by the seat of my pants. I'm hopefully going to break down some of the fights to the best of my ability, and what it really comes down to is just my instincts and where I'm going to go with these matchups. So hopefully that pans out. If it doesn't, we're back to the drawing board. If it does, maybe I try it again in the future. Also, the bet packs will be available. I'm coming off not a bad fight. I went 7-4 at UFC 174. I went 5-0 on the main card, which is pretty solid, and I had a couple preliminary fights that turned out in my favor. Let's continue. We have a ton of fights on June 28th to look at, so let's get to the first one. We're going to start with the UFC Auckland card, which is 4 main card fights, and we're kicking it off in the UFC's welterweight division. Is 12-4-0 Robert Whittaker, Tough Smashes champion, battles Mike Biggie Rhodes with a record of 6-2-0. Whittaker will certainly be the home favorite considering he's originally from New Zealand. He was born there. They hail him from Australia, but he certainly will have some fans here, I would expect. Mike Biggie Rhodes having to make the big trip from the United States over to Australia, which could be an impactor. We looked at Biggie Rhodes. In his first fight, he lost to George Sullivan in a fight he was expected to win, a 3-round decision defeat. Well, Robert Whittaker is coming off a fairly long layoff, hasn't fought since August 2013, so not quite a full year. It was a loss to Court McGee, which snapped his 2-fight UFC winning streak. Biggie Rhodes is fairly green. He's fought limited competition. He does have a fight and a loss to Brandon Thatch, which was by submission. 3 wins by knockout. His striking is pretty solid. It's still a work in progress, though. Conditioning-wise, there could be a bit of an issue there if this fight does go deep, which I anticipate it will. I really like Robert Whittaker's striking style. It's a little bit, little unorthodox, which can throw guys off, and he throws power. With Court McGee, he simply got outworked. I don't think that'll be the case with Mike Biggie Rhodes, and I'm leaning towards Whittaker here. I think he simply will land the better strikes, the more efficient strikes. He outworks Biggie Rhodes, and my prediction is Robert Whittaker to defeat Mike Rhodes by decision. In the bantamweight division, Hatsu Aoki, 27-7-2, battles Charles do Bronx Oliveira, the record of 17 wins, 4 losses, and 1 no contest. And it's surprising. It shows how deep the divisions are. Neither one of these guys is currently ranked within the division. Oliveira's coming off a submission win over Andy Ogle, which snapped a 2-fight losing streak. And Hatsu Aoki is also coming off a win over Ivan Menjivar, which snapped a 3-fight losing streak. But you take a look at these guys who they fought and lost to during these slumps. Aoki, basically, he had lost to some of the top guys in the division, Clay Guida, Ricardo Lamas, and a very tough out in Darren Elkins. He did give Ivan Menjivar his walking papers with his win. For Oliveira, losing to Cub Swanson and Frankie Edgar, again, 2 of the top-ranked guys in the division. So no shame in that. Certainly the winner of this 2-fight winning streak will rebound in the division. Now taking a look at this, these guys are both grappling aces. Oliveira is a BJJ black belt and lethal on the mat, with 10 of his 17 wins coming by submission. He's dominant. As I said, he tapped out Andy Ogle. He submitted Jonathan Brookins. He also pulled off that reverse calf slicer against Eric Wisely when he put him down. He's very dangerous. He also holds a submission win over Darren Elkins in his UFC debut, which was quite impressive. I also called him an upset over Efrain Escudero by submission in a second fight. For Hatsu Aoki, 12 of 27 wins by submission as well. He's a little more diverse with his win totals, 4 knockouts overall, 11 decision victories. He defeated Bart Palszewski, being the better man on the mat in that fight. What I'm looking at overall here, and actually, going back to the win totals, if you look at Oliveira, he certainly is no slouch in the feet. He has 6 wins by knockout, but he also has been knocked out twice. Well, conversely, Hatsu Aoki's never been submitted, never been knocked out. He has an iron chin, very good submission defense on the mat. We did see Oliveira get a little bit overconfident on the floor with Jim Miller and got submitted by a knee bar at UFC 124, and he has been knocked out twice. I don't foresee Aoki landing enough to knock out Oliveira, but the submission certainly is an issue. And again, that was at lightweight. This is taking place at featherweight. This could be a fantastic ground match between these two absolute wonderful floor technicians. As I mentioned, both are BJJ black belts. And the thing is, a lot of people talk about how grappling battles, or battles between two good grapplers, could be played out on the feet and be a sloppy kickboxing fight. I don't think so. Both these guys are capable kickboxers and are more than able to hold their own on the feet, and we could see a good matchup there. Either way, I really like what Charles Oliveira brings to the cage. I think he's a more dynamic striker. He throws a number of techniques. He's not afraid to go to his back, even though it's not the most intelligent thing to do against Hatsu Aoki. I've seen Aoki have some very difficult times with some aggressive grapplers. Darren Elkins put him on his back. Clay Guida did the same thing. Ricardo Lamas got right in his face and took it to him, and I think that's a major issue. We'll see Charles Oliveira, who will not hesitate to go to the floor with Aoki and be aggressive. Both are long, lean guys. There won't really be an advantage for either one, but I really like Oliveira's kicking game. He's got some dynamic striking. He very much held his own with Frankie Edgar and bloodied him up a little bit. I think that experience has turned him into a better fighter. Submitting Annie Ogle, who's a tough, durable guy, and that came in the third round, which shows that Oliveira was not coasting. He was looking to finish the fight. I was impressed with that performance. Aoki's win over Ivan Menjivar, he got the job done. He was the better grappler. He took advantage of a guy who simply could not defend the takedowns. It was good to pick up the victory. Still, I'm not overly... he hasn't impressed me in quite some time, especially going back to the Clay Guida and Darren Elkins fights, where he simply didn't have enough to offer off his back and couldn't get in positions where he knew he was losing. Either way, I simply feel Oliveira has more to offer, and this is a bit of a surprise. My prediction is Charles Oliveira to defeat Hatsu Aoki. I think he's going to catch him by submission. In the co-main event, we're in the UFC's heavyweight division for a battle of two big boys. As the number 14th ranked Soa the Hulk Paleli, 21-3-0 battles the Big Show, Jared Rosholt, with a record of 10-1-0. Soa obviously will be the favorite here coming out of Australia. Again, I know we're in New Zealand. I keep saying that. The point is he will be the local compared to the American Jared Rosholt. Now, both these guys are grappling-based fighters. Rosholt comes from a wrestling background, a former NCAA Division I competitor. Overall, pretty even split as far as wins. 3 knockouts, 3 submissions, 4 decisions. Really worked his ground game in his last fight in his victory over Daniel Omianchuk. So Paleli, on the other hand, also he's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but the thing is, just 4 wins by submission. He's actually been tapped out twice. His forte is not putting guys on the floor and submitting them. His forte is putting guys on the ground and pounding them out. He is riding a current winning streak of a significant winning streak, and I'm just going to count it up: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 wins in a row, 11 straight knockout victories, either TKO or KO, with only 2 of those fights going outside the first round, including his UFC debut against Nikita Krylov, where it went to the third round. That was the fight he gassed incredibly. He gassed with. There was the broken rib issue. But nonetheless, the man is a beast. In his win over Ruan Potts, he put him on his back and dropped some big shots and put Potts, who arguably shouldn't be in the UFC, he put him down with relative ease. Now, Jarrett Rosholt in his debut didn't overly impress us. Walt Harris exploited some of Rosholt's defensive striking issues and was able to simply outwork him early. But when Walt Harris slowed down, that's when the grinding style of Rosholt took over and controlled that fight, eventually put him on his back late. But for the most part, if Rosholt can't score takedowns, his striking, it's fairly simplistic. It's against a guy who's not a strong striker, he can hold up. But, Soa Paleli, he's pretty decent on the feet, and that's something I kind of wonder, can Rosholt put Soa on the mat? And that's going to be very difficult. And I just don't see it happening. Paleli's a big man, excellent grappling, well-versed veteran. I see him being able to keep Rosholt backed up and so outworking him. The conditioning issue is something I'm concerned about with Paleli versus Rosholt, who's a wrestler, very relatively decent condition, even though he is a heavyweight. In his last fight, he used his ground game as his forte, and that's where it came through and showed up. I don't think he'll have any success there. I think, if anybody, wouldn't be surprised to see Soa put Jared on his backside and control him. But nonetheless, I think Soa gets the better of the striking, and Rosholt's only been defeated once. It was by knockout, but he also did get knocked down by Walt Harris in the debut. I think Soa lands a big shot, so my prediction is Soa Paleli to defeat Jared Rosholt by knockout. In the main event of the UFC Fight Night 43 event, we have a middleweight matchup, which is very interesting. We have James Tahuna, 18-7-0, battling Nate the Great Marquardt, 35-13-2. And this is very interesting considering the fact that James Tahuna is coming down from light heavyweight into this matchup, where on the other side of things, Nate Marquardt's coming up from welterweight, returning back to a division where he once was a top title challenger a number of years ago when he fought Anderson Silva. Tahuna's coming off back-to-back defeats, both inside the first round, Glover Teixeira submitting him and Shogun Rua knocking him out in just a buck 03. Well, Nate Marquardt coming off 3 consecutive losses, one that involved him dropping his strike Strikeforce title to Tarek Safadine, a one-sided beatdown involving a series of ruthless leg kicks, and then back-to-back first-round knockouts against Jake Ellenberger and Hector Lombard, a pair of guys who throw absolute fire in their hands. Now, again, this is a very interesting matchup physically, because you have one guy coming down from light heavyweight and you have another guy going back up to middleweight from welterweight. They're roughly the same height. I would say Tehuna's a little bit taller. And the big question is, how does the lack of a cut from Marquardt affect him? Does he go? He looked very good at welterweight, but does going back up to middleweight help him as far as his conditioning concerns are and his movement? For James Te Huna, he had some conditioning issues at 205. Showed again in the Ryan Jimmo fight and showed in the Joey Beltran fight that he can go the distance and be successful. And the big issue is coming down to middleweight. Does that help him eat cleaner, train better, and get in better condition, or is the cut simply too much? Either way, it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. And one point of interest is James Te Huna also fought Hector Lombard and lost via submission due to injury way back in 2007. So there's a common opponent between him and Nate Marquardt. Now, if you look at their numbers, Te Huna 10 wins by knockout, 3 wins by submission, but he has been submitted 5 times in his career. So that's a major concern against a guy like Nate Marquardt, because when you look at his totals, or even before then, the guy's a BJJ black belt, second-degree BJJ black belt, so very talented on the ground. He's also well-versed in black belt and pancration, so he's very good on the mat. He's a competent grappler. His numbers suggest he is more than capable of pulling off a submission win when the opportunity presents itself. 15 of his 32 wins have come by submission. He's also been tapped out twice. But the thing is, if you start going down his ledger, it's been a number of fights since we saw him put someone away via submission. The last one coming at UFC 81 against Jeremy Horn. He caught him in a standing guillotine back in 2008. So he's become much more of a striking-oriented fighter. He will take the fight to the floor periodically, but he tends to want to stand and bang, and that's where his issues show up. Te Huna's been submitted 5 times, most recently Glover Teixeira. Nate's been knocked out 3 times in his career, and it's a major concern against a guy like James Newton, who throws fire, and he's very aggressive with his strike, and he comes out and looks to overwhelm. Nate, in his fights against Hector Lombard and Jake Ellenberger, tried to be fast, tried to work the outside. We saw him in a similar strategy that worked against Tyrone Woodley, be elusive, land, stick, move, land some kicks, land some strikes, but never really committed anything. Against Lombard and Ellenberger, when they eventually moved in, landed that big shot and swarmed him, they put him down with relative ease. And I'm not talking a TKO victory. Both of them were registered in as knockouts because Nate went out, and that's a concern against Te Huna. And the thing is, if Nate can survive that first round, maybe 2 rounds, then I could see him maybe taking advantage of James Te Huna gassing out and outpointing him. But those first 2 rounds are going to be very difficult. I expect Te Huna to be very fired up, to be fighting at least close to home, and I expect him to come out and be aggressive. So my prediction is James Te Huna to defeat Nate Marquardt by knockout. We now switch continents as we head over to UFC Fight Night 44, which will take place in San Antonio, Texas, later in the evening for us in North America at least, and it will feature 6 main card fights, the first of which taking place in the UFC's lightweight division, as Joe Excalibur Ellenberger, the brother of Jake Ellenberger, takes on the debuting Bryan Barberena. Ellenberger carries an impressive record of 14 wins and 1 loss. Barberena record of 9-2, and he's actually filling in for Francisco Trevino, who was originally pulled. Ellenberger's last fight, or original UFC debut date, was scrapped due to injury, last second injury that being. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this matchup. Ellenberger, pretty impressive record, 8 wins by knockout, 4 submission wins. His last fight took place, though, in December 15th, 2012, so he's been out of action for a considerable amount of time and been on the shelf, and that has to be frustrating considering his last fight was pulled due to injury, so I'm assuming he's going to be raring to get in there and get at this. He does have a loss against Justin Salas back in late 2011, so he's fought at least one guy who's has some UFC experience, so keep that in mind. For Barberena, though, coming in on short notice, he's coming off a win over Eric Moon via TKO. He's won 6 fights in a row, which is pretty solid, 7 of those by knockout, so he certainly has some power. He's never fought anybody of major significance. I expect Ellenberger's wrestling to simply make him the better fighter. In the footage I've seen of Barberena, he's a scrappy guy. He has power. Actually, he did fight one guy of significance, or at least a name that pops up, was Dane Sayers back at Dakota FC 13, which took place in mid-2012. Dane Sayers, Ultimate Fighter fame, or at least his time spent on the Ultimate Fighter. And Barberena didn't overly impress me. It was a 5-round decision win. Sayers had a lot of success in that fight. I think Ellenberger is simply too much for him. So my prediction is Joe Ellenberger to defeat Bryan Barberena. I'll take Ellenberger to do it by knockout. In the UFC's middleweight division, Clint Hester of Ultimate Fighter fame, with a record of 10 wins and 3 losses, battles Brazilian Antonio Braga Neto with a record of 9 wins, 1 loss, and 1 no contest. Hester comes into this matchup having picked up a number of wins. He's riding a current 3-fight UFC win streak, and overall he's won 6 in a row. Braga Neto has won 4 consecutive and is undefeated over his last 5 with a no contest in that ruling. Now, taking a look at this matchup, what we have here is that traditional striker versus grappler. Clint Hester coming from a boxing background, with 7 of his 10 UFC or MMA wins coming by knockout, versus Neto coming as a BJJ, well-versed and very dangerous grappler, a BJJ black belt, with 7 of his 9 victories coming by submission. Look at his last 3 fights. He submitted Anthony Smith in his UFC debut, and I really like Anthony Smith as a fighter. On a side note, it's unfortunate he was ousted from the UFC after that fight. I think he's in Bellator right now. I'd really like to see him continue to have success, especially with Scott Coker there with their Strikeforce connection. Back to Neto. He also submitted Brock Larson in his last pre-UFC tune-up. And he tapped out Michael Falco in the Amazon Forest combat matchup with a Kimura. The guy's very dangerous, nonetheless, on the floor. The big question is, can he get it there? Clint Hester's been working, and you guarantee he'll have been drilling his counter wrestling coming to this matchup. Defend, 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 and that is his focus in this matchup. He should be the physically stronger man, but Neto, talent in most situations will overcome physical strength. Now, keep in mind, Neto has competed at heavyweight before. This fight's taking place at 185, so he's more than versed in competing with bigger, stronger men that he should be able to throw around. I struggle to believe Clint Hester's submission defense will be there. You can train as much as you want, but when Neto's been doing what he's been doing for as long as he has been, I anticipate that he'll have no problem locking up a submission and dragging the fight to the ground. Even if he pulls guard, he should be able to avoid the big shots of Clint Hester. I could really see him locking on, attacking the leg and looking for a submission there. Either way, my prediction is Antonio Braga Neto to defeat Clint Hester by submission. In the UFC's featherweight division, the number 3 ranked Ricardo the Bully Lamas, 13-3-0, battles Novo União camp member Hakran Diaz with a record of 21 wins, 2 losses, and a single defeat. Lamas is coming off a loss to Diaz's training partner in Jose Aldo. Prior to that, he had won 4 consecutive bouts to earn that title shot. Diaz is coming off a loss against Nick Lentz, which snapped his considerable winning streak. He had won 9 straight fights, including an impressive UFC 147 upset of Yuri Alcantara, a fight I had predicted that he would win. Diaz comes in with 3 wins by knockout and 9 impressive submission wins. He's also 9-2 in fights that go to the judges, so he's never been finished, and he certainly knows how to do enough to win the fight with the judges. We know about Novo União's camp. They have excellent offensive and defensive wrestling, and that's something they pride themselves on. And he certainly, in the Yuri Alcantara fight, he showed how strong he is in his top game, putting Alcantara on the ground, who's very dangerous off his back, controlling and getting the better of those transitions and those exchanges en route to a victory. Unfortunately, in his next matchup, he fought Nick Lentz, and Lentz was able to ground him out. Now, we did see a couple close submission attempts by Hakran, and he eventually rallied back against Lentz as Lentz gassed out, but Nick Lentz went into Brazil, defeated Hakran Diaz, and took that fight relatively one-sided, at least for the first 2 rounds. That's something Diaz is going to want to look out here. So certainly he's not showing that defensive grappling like Renan Barão, like Jose Aldo, that's almost impenetrable with these guys, can't be put on their back, but he's a very good wrestler nonetheless. For Ricardo Lamas, the guy's got 4 wins by knockout, 3 submissions, and 6 decisions, so he's well-versed in all areas. He comes from a wrestling background, former NCAA Division III wrestler. He's also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We saw him, and as I mentioned this earlier in the show, he took it to Hatsu Aoki in a very impressive fashion on the mat, attempted a couple of submissions, got the better of that. We saw him submit Cub Swanson, which is no easy feat. He also TKO'd Eric Koch on the ground, which is solid. Against Jose Aldo, he struggled early, and eventually, I think the speed was the biggest issue. Eventually, he lost by decision. He did have his moments, especially later in that fight, but nonetheless, it really wasn't his strongest outing. He has been TKO'd or knocked out twice. Yuri Alcantara stopped him at WEC 53, and Danny Castillo fighting at lightweight. He also took him out at WEC 42. What I'm looking at here is Hakran Diaz seems to live and die with his wrestling. If he can get the better of the wrestling exchanges, he is the better. He has success, and he usually that's how what his strong suit is. But when he can't, like was the case against Nick Lentz, that's when he struggles. And I really struggle to see Hakran Diaz putting Ricardo Lamas on his back with regularity. So one of 2 scenarios plays out here. Either Ricardo Lamas gets the better of the grappling exchanges, puts Diaz on his back, and defends any takedowns that comes his way, and Ricardo uses his wrestling, or neither man uses their wrestling, or they do, and it's a stalemate either way, and we're this fight simply decided by striking, and in that situation, I like Lamas' striking. He throws decent. He has a decent arsenal with both his kicks, excellent leg kicks, and Diaz, for me, is a little bit slower on the feet, a little bit stiff with his striking. While he is more than capable, I still favor Ricardo Lamas and what he brings. I think Ricardo will find success with his wrestling. He needs to be very careful here not to have a letdown coming off a title fight, which is certainly a real thing, knowing he lost to the champion and he needs to rebuild himself up. This is a fight he doesn't want to overlook, and Diaz obviously will have a chance to chat with Jose Aldo to see, what can I do, what can you tell me to make me successful in this fight. Nonetheless, I still like what Ricardo Lamas brings in this matchup, so my prediction is Ricardo Lamas to defeat Hakran Diaz by decision. In the UFC's middleweight division, Ultimate Fighter Brazil champion Cesar Ferreira Mutante battles with a record of 8-3-0, battles Andrew Highlight Craig with a record of 9-2-0. Both guys are coming off defeats. Ferrer was knocked out by CB Delwin in an upset. Again, an upset I predicted. I keep saying that. Prior to that, he had won 3 consecutive UFC bouts, including his debut fight, which captured him the Ultimate Fighter crown. For Andrew Craig, he has now lost 2 of his last 3 with a win over Chris Lieben, sandwiched between. He was most recently submitted by Luke Barnett. Now, that's a very interesting matchup. Both guys certainly in need of a win, and that's something to keep in mind. Craig is a Texas native from Houston, so he certainly should have the crowd in his corner, and that's Cesar Ferreira. You look at what his record is, or at least he hasn't fought outside of Brazil in a number of fights. You have to go all the way back to 2011 when he fought Elvis Muchapik, where he lost by knockout. It was the last time he stepped outside of Brazil for a matchup. His last 4 UFC fights have been at home, so he'll actually be the quote-unquote bad guy in this matchup. Looking at Cesar first, 3 wins by knockout, 2 wins by submission, 2 decision. He's also been knocked out twice, so his chin's a little bit iffy, and those are both of his last 2 losses. Accreditation-wise, he's a BJJ Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and a master in capoeira. So you'll see some of those interesting kicks, the capoeira style kicks, come out in his game plan. We did see his grappling show up more so in the Daniel Sarafian fight, where he took Sarafian down a number of times and able to score. And that's one thing. We look at Andrew Craig's resume. He's a brown belt in BJJ. He's 1-1 in fights ended by submission, coming off a submission loss. But you go back to 2 fights earlier. Pardon me. When he fought Honey Marks, and Marks really dominated with his ground game, and Andrew Craig did not get anything going in that matchup prior to seeing Honey Marks gas out, and that's where the issues came. You go one fight further against Rafael Natal. Craig was simply getting outworked on the feet, and eventually in that matchup, Natal got careless, took a big shot, got knocked out. And there's a lot of those fights going on. Kyle Noak, again, hurt himself in that fight against Craig and was having success early before Craig took advantage of the injury and was able to score the decision victory. His one real win where he looked very good was against Chris Lieben, and that's not something overly something to be proud of as far as the state of Lieben's career. He certainly was at his end. For Cesar Ferreira or Ferreira, depending on what you want to say, if you're John Anik, don't even get me started on that. He has some issues. He's been blitzed in fights. Both Sergio Moraes and Thiago Santos had some success landing some strikes against him, or a couple strikes. We saw Santos at least go after him. Either way, I'm just not 100% sold at Andrew Craig enough to say he takes the victory here. He could outwork Ferreira, but I could see Ferreira using his wrestling, putting him down again. He's working under that Black Zillion camp. I can see him drilling his wrestling, trying to exploit Andrew Craig's defensive grappling issues. Also, we saw Craig get dropped a couple times by Josh Barnett or by Luke Barnett. Fajeda could look to exploit that as well. So either way, I think Fajeda simply has more chances to go for victory here. It's a bit of a risk here, so it really could go either way. My prediction is Cesar Fajeda to defeat Andrew Craig. I'll take Fajeda to do it by submission. In the UFC's welterweight divisions, where we find our co-main event of the evening, is the number 11th ranked Kelvin Gastelum, an Ultimate Fighter winner, undefeated with a record of 9-0, battles 12-2-0 Nico Masoki. Coming into this matchup, Kelvin Gastelum has won 3 consecutive bouts, a split decision victory over Uriah Hall, a submission victory over Brian Melanson, and then a split decision over the well-traveled Rick Story. Masoki, on the other hand, he's also on a significant winning streak. He won against Alessio Sakara in his debut, took out Viscardi Andrade in his next matchup, and now he's heading here. The Viscardi Andrade fight was a little bit interesting. It was an upset. Certainly both fights so far have been upsets, and he's the underdog once again in this matchup. He took out Alessio Sakara by submission, which was quite impressive that he's able to pull that off. And now against Andrade, of course, that first fight was his debut performance. Looking at Andrade first, looking at Muskoki first, he comes in with 4 wins by knockout, 5 wins by submission, and 3 decision victories. So he's a well-versed fighter. He's more than capable of pulling off victories. We saw off his back when he caught Sakara with a pretty nice armbar. He's got some good strikes. I like the way he throws his strikes around his opponent's guard. He throws some nice hooks, and he has a little bit of pop in his hands. For Kelvin Gastelum, he's a purple belt in BJJ. He comes from a grappling background. Overall in his career, he showed just tenacity and aggression, and that's what got him. A lot of people talk about him as the mini Cain Velasquez. That's what got him the victory in The Ultimate Fighter. 3 wins by knockout, 3 submissions, and 2 decision wins. So again, just like Masoki, he's very capable of pulling off a number of different ways to win this matchup. The one looking at Nico, though, he got cracked a couple times. He's never actually lost by knockout, but Sakara hit him a couple times and hurt him, and so did Andrade, and he was in trouble, in significant trouble. So much so that Viscardi Andrade celebrated the victory and then realized, no, it's not over yet, and then gassed out, and Nico took the fight over. I don't think that's going to be an issue with Kelvin Gastelum, because he's the type of guy you have to pull off your opponent once you do the damage. He destroyed Brian Melanson, hurt him on the feet, and submitted him. Similar against Rick Story. I struggle to believe, Masoki could maybe catch him off his back, but I think what it comes down to is Kelvin Gastelum is simply going to be too much for Nico on the floor, and on the feet he throws too hard, and Masoki's chin is too much of a question mark to really back the Swedish fighter here. And, Kelvin Gastelum, again, fighting in San Jose, that's an advantage. It's not nearly as far away from Texas as Sweden is, where Masoki will be coming out of. So you have to worry about the travel issues as well coming into that matchup. Either way, I like Gastelum. He's young, he's aggressive, he's hungry. This is a perfect matchup for him. So my prediction is Kelvin Gastelum to defeat Nico Masoki. I'll take him by knockout. We now cap things off with the main event of UFC Fight Night 44, taking place in the featherweight division, as 25-0 Cub Swanson battles 23-9-0 Jeremy Little Heathen Stevens in a matchup that has massive title shot implications. For Cub Swanson, a win here could very well earn him the next shot at the winner of Chad Money Mendez and Jose Aldo. Got people he's fought and lost to, each one of them. For Jeremy Stevens, he might not get a title shot with a win here, but he certainly will be on the cusp of an opportunity if he does pull off the victory. Cub Swanson has righted the ship since his UFC debut loss to Ricardo Lamas. He TKO'd George Roop, Ross Pearson, and Charles Oliveira. Took a impressive submission decision victory over Dustin Poirier, who's a fighter on the rise as well, and he's coming off a TKO victory over Dennis Siver back at UFC 162. He's on a little bit of a layoff, unfortunately, almost a year by the time this fight takes place, so that's something to keep in mind. For Jeremy Stevens, he dropped down to featherweight after a 3-fight losing streak at lightweight that ended with a knockout loss to Eve Edwards, an upset I predicted. Since dropping down, he has a dominant decision win over Esteban Payan. He had a vicious knockout over Hani Jason via head kick in front of the Brazilian crowd, only 40 seconds. And he's coming off a pretty solid decision victory over Darren Elkins, where he simply was the better fighter. Now you look at their totals. Jeremy Stevens, 23 victories, 15 of them have come by knockout. This guy has lightning in his hands. The rest of the total is not nearly as impressive. 3 submission wins, 3 submission losses. Decision-wise, he's 5-5, so he's at 500 if he doesn't in fights that are ended by knockout. He's a black belt in BJJ, so he is capable on the floor, but his numbers certainly don't suggest he's a dominant grappler. But again, we saw him use wrestling against Esteban Payan to pull off that victory. For Cub Swanson, he's coming in. He's a BJJ black belt, very capable on the floor, good wrestling, good submission skills. He seems to have tightened things up since that loss against Ricardo Lamas. His total finishing numbers are impressive. 8 wins by knockout, 7 wins by submission, and 5 decision wins. The key there is he's he's capable of winning in all areas. He's lost just 1 by knockout. He has been submitted 3 times, so on the ground he's vulnerable, but against Jeremy Stevens, I don't think that'll be an issue. Decision-wise, he has lost just 1 time, so he knows how to outpoint and outwork his opponents. This is a very interesting matchup. Stevens, this is his first real test when you move down to featherweight. Taking nothing away from the other 3 guys, Darren Elkins is a tough guy, but he's not the type of featherweight he's going to give a guy coming down from lightweight issues. And what I'm saying is Elkins prides himself on using his size as a former lightweight and grinding guys out. With Cub Swanson now, he's very fast, and I anticipate this fight's going to be decided on the feet. Jeremy Stevens throws incredible leather, but he tends to get a little one-dimensional with his striking, and I thought I saw that returning to his game against Darren Elkins. He needs to be more diverse. He needs to mix up his strikes, set up the big shots, and hope the knockout comes, not try and just make the knockout happen. If he does that, his opponent can anticipate, and Cub Swanson is very fast. He's able to avoid strikes. We saw him against Dennis Siver. Dennis Siver is a very competent kickboxer, and Cub Swanson was able to avoid a ton of his strikes and eventually put him down with a big shot in the second round. Either way, I think Cub Swanson, with the capoeira kicks and a variety of high-risk maneuvers he attempts, he needs to cut that down a little bit to avoid giving Stevens opportunistic moments where Stevens could capitalize on it in a 5-round fight. That could be an issue, especially if Stevens can get a couple rounds in the bag. But what I see Cub Swanson doing doing is simply being the more active fighter, landing the better shots, making Stevens swing and miss. We've seen Jeremy struggle with more technical strikers going back to his matchup with Donald Cerrone. Eve Edwards took him out with a knockout. Cub Swanson has power against Stevens moving down from lightweight. We don't know if Swanson has the type of power that can put Stevens down. I actually think he can, so my prediction, though, is Cub Swanson to defeat Jeremy Stevens by knockout. So those are my predictions. 10 fights in all for the UFC Fight Night 43 and 44 cards. Again, like I said, I did it off the cuff, where I didn't do as much research and point form and refined breakdowns, but I gave you the information I thought. I leaned on these fights. Again, this might be the best way to do it. Instead of overthinking it, just come up with the best possible breakdown and scenario I can see how these fights end. Either way, thank you as always for tuning in and listening. All of my preliminary predictions will be available at kamikazeoverdrive.net. We have a very busy summer ahead of us, and I'll talk to you soon.